The girls of Nyaruba High School for girls buzzed with excitement as the new term began. Everyone was eager to meet the new biology teacher, Madam Zinga. The previous teacher had retired unexpectedly, and rumors about her replacement had swirled for weeks. When Madam Zinga stepped into the assembly hall that morning, she instantly commanded attention. Tall and regal, she moved with a grace that felt almost otherworldly. Her skin glowed like polished ebony, and her piercing eyes seemed to see straight through you. She introduced herself with a calm but commanding voice. "I expect discipline and focus in my class," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. The students whispered amongst themselves as she left the stage. "She's so elegant," one girl murmured. "But doesn't she seem distant?" another replied. As the day wore on, Madam Zinga's charm intrigued students and staff alike, though some noted an unusual chill in her presence. Nandi, a lively and curious senior, was one of them. She watched Madam Zinga from the dormitory window that evening and noticed something odd. The teacher was pacing the grounds alone, holding a red flask in her hand. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, but there was no one there. "She's just stressed," Nandi reasoned aloud, turning to her roommate, Zola. But a flicker of doubt lingered in her mind. Later that night, as the dormitory lights went out, Nandi couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to Madam Zinga and that strange flask. She felt an inexplicable unease, as though a shadow had fallen over the school. It was only the first day, but something about Madam Zinga didn't feel right. That night, the atmosphere in Dormitory B was alive with chatter. The girls were still buzzing about Madam Zinga. Her striking beauty, her cold demeanor, and, most of all, her strange nightly wanderings had already become a favorite topic of gossip. "I saw her pacing near the garden," one girl said, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "She was talking to herself." "No way," another replied. "Maybe she's lonely or misses her family." Zola, who was reading under the dim light of a torch, sighed loudly. "You're all overreacting. She's probably adjusting to the new place. Not everyone wants to make friends." Nandi, however, couldn't shake what she'd seen. "But what about the red flask?" she asked. "Why would she be wandering so late at night?" Zola rolled her eyes. "Why are you so fixated on her? Maybe it's tea or medicine." Nandi stayed silent, but the unease in her chest grew. Later that night, as the dormitory lights dimmed and the girls drifted off to sleep, Nandi found herself wide awake. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. The image of Madam Zinga's red flask haunted her. At midnight, a faint sound drifted through the dormitory window. It was humming, low, soft, and unrecognizable. Nandi froze in her bed, listening closely. Peeking out from under her blanket, she noticed a faint figure walking past the dormitory. She slid out of bed carefully and tiptoed to the window. Sure enough, Madam Zinga was there, walking toward the old, abandoned science wing. She held the red flask tightly, and her movements were almost hypnotic. Nandi's stomach turned. "What is she doing out there?" she whispered to herself. The question lingered in her mind as the night grew darker. The following morning, chaos erupted in the dining hall. Amina, the school's star athlete, was missing. Her bed was untouched, and no one had seen her since the previous evening. Whispers of concern filled the air, but the administration was quick to address the situation. Principal Otieno stood at the podium, her voice calm but firm. "Amina is likely visiting her family without permission. We have contacted her parents and will update you as soon as we know more. Please focus on your studies." The explanation didn't sit well with Nandi. Amina had been her usual cheerful self the day before, laughing about the upcoming track meet and promising to win the gold medal for the school. "She wouldn't just leave," Nandi muttered to Zola as they walked back to class. "Maybe she got overwhelmed," Zola replied, though even she sounded unsure. You know how these things go. As the day wore on, Nandi couldn't stop thinking about the incident. Her unease grew when Adhiambo, another classmate, fainted during biology class. Madam Zinga, who had been explaining photosynthesis, paused mid-sentence, her gaze lingering on Adhiambo as she was helped out of the room. Later, Nandi visited Adhiambo in the infirmary. "What happened?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Adhiambo replied weakly. "I just feel so drained. I've been feeling this way since last night." "Were you in the science lab?" Nandi pressed. Adhiambo nodded. "Madam Zinga asked me to stay behind and clean up after class." Nandi's heart raced. Something wasn't right. First Amina's disappearance, and now Adhiambo's mysterious illness. The pieces didn't fit, but Nandi was certain of one thing: Madam Zinga was at the center of it all. That night, Nandi lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded her as thoughts of Amina's disappearance and Adhiambo's strange illness swirled in her mind. She tried to piece everything together, but nothing made sense. Exhausted, she eventually drifted into a restless sleep. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling. In the dream, she found herself in a dimly lit room surrounded by flickering candles. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and at the center of the room stood Madam Zinga. She was holding the red flask, its contents glowing ominously. Madam Zinga's eyes burned like embers as she tipped the flask to her lips. As she drank, ghostly faces swirled in the liquid, Amina's face among them. Nandi tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Madam Zinga turned to her, a sinister smile spreading across her face. "You're next," she whispered. Nandi woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. Sweat clung to her forehead, and the room felt suffocatingly hot. She sat up, clutching her blanket tightly. The dream had felt so real, too real to dismiss. The next morning, she shared the dream with Zola. "You're scaring yourself," Zola said, though her tone lacked conviction. "It's just a dream, Nandi." "Then why does it feel like more than that?" Nandi snapped. "Amina is missing, Adhiambo is sick, and Madam Zinga, there's something wrong with her." Zola sighed. "Look, if it makes you feel better, we'll keep an eye on her. But don't jump to conclusions." Later that day, Nandi noticed faint marks on Adhiambo's neck. "Did something bite you?" she asked. Adhiambo frowned, confused. "I don't know," she murmured. "I don't remember." Nandi's unease deepened. The dream wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. The following day, Nandi's unease turned into resolve. She couldn't ignore the strange events any longer. The missing Amina, Adhiambo's sudden illness, her nightmare, it all pointed to one person, Madam Zinga. But she needed proof. She turned to Zola during lunch. "We have to check the old science wing tonight," Nandi said in a low voice. "That's where she goes every night with that flask." Zola hesitated, pushing her food around on her plate. "You're taking this too far, Nandi. If we get caught, do you really want to wait until someone else disappears?" Nandi interrupted. Zola sighed and reluctantly agreed. Later that night, the two girls slipped out of their dormitory, their footsteps muffled against the cool grass. The old science wing loomed in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding. It had been abandoned years ago after a fire damaged part of the building. Students were forbidden to enter, but that hadn't stopped Madam Zinga. The door was locked, as expected, but Nandi had come prepared. She pointed to a broken window near the side of the building. "We'll go in through there," she whispered. Inside, the air was heavy and cold, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Dust covered the surfaces, and broken glass crunched underfoot. The girls found themselves in what used to be a laboratory. Rusted shelves lined the walls, holding jars filled with murky liquids and dried herbs. What is all this? Zola whispered, running her finger over one of the jars. Nandi was about to respond when a noise made them freeze. Footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder with each step. Panicking, the girls crouched behind the cabinet, holding their breath as the footsteps stopped just outside the room. Nandi and Zola crouched in silence as the footsteps outside the room stopped. For a moment, neither of them dared to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps receded. The girls exchanged a panicked look but remained frozen until the sound faded completely. "We need to leave," Zola whispered, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Nandi insisted. "We haven't found anything." Zola reluctantly followed as Nandi tiptoed toward a shelf filled with books and papers. They found faded notebooks, diagrams of plants, and a strange journal bound in leather. Nandi slipped the journal into her pocket just as they heard the footsteps again, this time accompanied by a low humming. "It's her," Zola mouthed, tugging on Nandi's sleeve. "Let's go." The two scrambled back to the window they had entered, slipping out just in time to see a shadowy figure enter the laboratory. Clutching the journal tightly, they ran back to their dormitory, their hearts pounding. Once safely inside, Nandi opened the journal. It was filled with strange symbols and charts. Toward the back, she found lists of names, students from the school. Some names were crossed out with red X's, including Amina's. "What does this mean?" Zola asked, her face pale. "I don't know," Nandi replied, her voice shaking. "But it's not good." The next day, Nandi shared the discovery with Zola during a quiet moment. Zola's face turned grim as she recalled a story her grandmother had told her. "There's an old tale about an Ayama Yochikondi," she said. "A blood spirit. It preys on young people to stay strong. It can disguise itself as human." "You think?" "Madam Zinga," Nandi whispered. Zola nodded slowly. "I don't want to believe it, but everything fits." The discovery of the journal left Nandi and Zola shaken. The list of names, the cryptic symbols, it all pointed to something sinister. As the sun set that evening, the girls decided they needed to return to the old science wing to investigate further. "We can't let this go," Nandi said firmly. "We need to find out what else she's hiding." Zola hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Fine. But if we hear anything, we run." Armed with flashlights and an old scarf to cover their footprints in the dust, the girls slipped out of the dormitory again. The air was colder than the previous night, and the old science wing seemed even more forbidding. This time, they took care to search more thoroughly. Nandi flipped through stacks of papers and books while Zola scanned the shelves. In one corner, they found a loose floorboard. Nandi pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal similar to the one they had taken the night before. This one, however, contained far more chilling entries. Pages were filled with diagrams of human anatomy and detailed notes about essence extraction. Symbols and charts showed the lunar phases, with detailed descriptions of rituals for specific dates. "I think she's using the blood moon for something," Nandi whispered, flipping through the pages. "Look at this, she's been planning it for months." Before Zola could respond, the air in the room shifted. A faint humming filled the space, and the temperature dropped. Nandi quickly stuffed the journal into her bag as footsteps echoed down the hall. "It's her," Zola whispered. The girls darted toward the window, but before they could escape, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Madam Zinga stood there, her red flask glowing faintly in her hand. Madam Zinga's figure loomed in the doorway, the faint glow of her red flask casting eerie shadows on the walls. Nandi and Zola froze, their breaths caught in their throats. For a long moment, no one moved. "Who's there?" Madam Zinga's voice was calm but sharp, slicing through the silence like a blade. Without thinking, Nandi grabbed Zola's arm and pulled her toward the window. They slipped through the narrow opening and ran as fast as their legs could carry them, not daring to look back. The sound of humming echoed faintly behind them, but they didn't stop until they were safely back in the dormitory. Inside, both girls collapsed onto Nandi's bed, gasping for breath. "She saw us," Zola panted. "She knows someone was there." "But she didn't catch us," Nandi said, clutching the journal tightly. "We need to figure out what's in this before she does." Over the next few days, Nandi and Zola worked in secret to decipher the journal's contents. The more they read, the more terrified they became. The entries described rituals designed to extract essence from young people, particularly during phases of the moon. The blood moon was highlighted as a time of immense power. "She's draining the students," Nandi whispered one night as they pored over the journal in their dorm room. "That's why Amina disappeared, and why Adhiambo is so weak. She's using their blood." Zola's face turned pale. "But why? What does she gain?" "Power. Youth. Strength. It's all here," Nandi replied grimly, pointing to a diagram. "She's not human, Zola. She's something else." The realization left them shaken. They didn't know what Madame Zinga was planning for the blood moon, but they knew one thing for certain: they had to stop her. The following night, Nandi sat by the dormitory window, staring out at the moon as it hung low in the sky. It wasn't full yet, but it was nearing. She couldn't stop thinking about the diagrams in the journal. The blood moon was only a few nights away, and Madame Zinga's plans were growing clearer. "She's building up to something," Nandi said quietly, turning to Zola. "The journal mentioned a ritual during the blood moon. She's going to use it to gain more power." Zola shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What do we do? We can't just confront her, she'll know we've been snooping." "We have to warn someone," Nandi said, though her voice wavered. She thought of Principal Otieno, but the stern administrator had already dismissed Amina's disappearance as a runaway case. Would she even listen? The next day, another student fainted during class. This time it was Leila, a quiet girl from dormitory C. The pattern was unmistakable now. All the affected students had been seen spending extra time in Madame Nzinga's lab. At lunch, Nandi gathered Zola, along with two other trusted friends, Pendo and Leila's cousin Osha. Quietly, she explained what she and Zola had discovered. The other girls listened in stunned silence. "Are you saying she's a monster?" Osha whispered, her eyes wide. "Not just a monster. A blood spirit," Nandi said firmly. "And she's targeting us." Pendo frowned. "How do we stop her?" "If what you're saying is true, she's dangerous." "I don't know yet," Nandi admitted. "But we have to act fast. The blood moon is in 3 nights." The girls agreed to meet after curfew to plan. Time was running out, and they knew they were up against something far more powerful than they'd ever imagined. The 4 girls huddled together in the shadows of the dormitory common room after lights out. Nandi, Zola, Pendo, and Osha spoke in hushed voices, careful not to wake the other students or attract attention. Nandi laid the journal on the table, flipping through its pages of diagrams and cryptic notes. "This is where she documents her rituals," Nandi whispered, pointing to a detailed drawing of a moon. "The blood moon is the focal point. She's been draining students' energy to prepare for it." Pendo leaned closer, her face pale in the dim light. "What happens during the blood moon?" Nandi hesitated. "I think she plans to perform a full ritual. This journal says it will give her permanent strength and power, but it requires 3 sacrifices." Osha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sacrifices? Do you think she's already chosen who?" "Most likely," Nandi said grimly. "Amina was our first victim. Adhiambo and Leila have been weakened. They could be next. We have to stop her," Zola said, her voice trembling. But how? She's not human. She's some kind of spirit. Nandi nodded. That's why we need help. Mama Ofia might know something. Mama Ofia was the dorm matron, an elderly woman known for her knowledge of herbs, traditions, and old legends. The girls decided to approach her the following evening. As they prepared to return to their rooms, Pendo paused. What if she knows we are onto her? What if she comes after us? She won't, Nandi said firmly, though she wasn't entirely sure. We'll stick together and move quickly. If we are careful, we can stop her before the blood moon. But as they slipped back into their beds, the reality of the danger sank in. Time was running out, and their enemy was far more powerful than any of them could imagine.